What if I told you there's a Ford engine so powerful, so advanced, that NASCAR banned it before it ever turned a single lap in competition? Picture this. It's 1965, and in a Nevada race shop, mechanics are bolting together an engine that would become the most feared piece of American iron, never to compete. 657 horsepower, hemispherical combustion chambers, single overhead cams on a pushrod V8 block. This is the story of Ford's SOHC 427, the Cammer, and how one Nevada dealer operation helped create an engine so dominant NASCAR killed it before it could kill the competition. You have to understand what Ford was up against in 1965. Chrysler's 426, Hemi had just steamrolled through the 1964 NASCAR season like a hurricane through a trailer park. Richard Petty won the Daytona 500 by a full lap. Plymouth drivers took the top 3 spots. At race after race, the Hemis were making Ford's 427 wedge engines look like grocery getters. Ford executives were watching their Total Performance marketing campaign turn into total embarrassment on national television every Sunday. The boardroom meetings in Dearborn must have been brutal. Here's Ford pouring millions into racing, and they're getting their teeth kicked in by Chrysler week after week. Henry Ford II wasn't known for his patience, and losing wasn't in the Ford vocabulary. Something had to be done, and it had to be done fast. On and enter the Special Vehicles Department at Ford, and more importantly, enter Holman Moody, the legendary racing operation based out of Charlotte with a satellite shop in Nevada that would become ground zero for one of the most audacious engineering gambits in NASCAR history. John Holman and Ralph Moody weren't just mechanics, they were racing's equivalent of weapons designers, and Ford had just given them carte blanche to build a Hemi killer. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of just copying Chrysler's hemispherical combustion chamber design, Ford's engineers decided to leapfrog it entirely. They started with the existing 427 FE side oiler block, already a formidable foundation, producing around 425 horsepower in wedge form. But what they did next was revolutionary for American V8 design. They threw out the entire valve train. Gone were the push rods, rocker arms, and all the reciprocating mass that limited high RPM operation. In their place, a chain-driven single overhead camshaft for each bank of cylinders. Let me put that in perspective. In 1965, overhead cam engines were exotic European technology. Ferrari used them, Lotus used them, but in American V8s? This was like showing up to a knife fight with a laser gun. The cam rode directly above the valves, operating them through simple finger followers. No push rods flexing at high RPM, no rocker arm geometry to worry about. Just direct, precise valve control that could handle RPMs that would scatter a conventional pushrod engine across the track. The development process was insanity on a timeline. Ford engineers worked around the clock, knowing that every week they delayed meant another Chrysler victory on Sunday. The prototype heads were massive aluminum castings, each one a work of art. The combustion chambers were true hemispheres, allowing for huge 2.195-inch intake valves and 1.73-inch exhausts. Compare that to the wedge 427's 2.09 and 1.66-inch valves. Those extra few hundredths of an inch meant dramatically better breathing at high RPM, and the cam profiles were aggressive beyond anything Ford had attempted before. We're talking about 0.590 inches of valve lift and 324 degrees of duration. In layman's terms, those valves were opening wider and staying open longer than any production-based American engine had ever attempted. The springs had to be beefed up accordingly. Dual valve springs with dampers, capable of controlling the valves at engine speeds approaching 8,000 RPM. Instant. Now, Holman Moody's involvement wasn't just assembly. These guys were racers first, engineers second. They knew what it took to make power not just on a dyno, but in the heat of competition. Their Nevada shop became the testing ground where theory met reality. They experimented with different cam timing, various carburetor setups, and exhaust configurations. The initial engines used a single 4-barrel carburetor on a high-rise aluminum intake manifold, but Holman Moody quickly developed dual quad setups that could flow even more air. And the first dyno pulls were absolutely shocking. With relatively mild tuning and pump gas, 103-octane pump gas, which you could actually buy at Sunoco stations back then, the engine was putting down 616 horsepower at 7,000 RPM and 515 pound-feet of torque at 3,800 RPM. But that was just the beginning. With race gas, aggressive timing, and open headers, Holman Moody's tuners were seeing numbers north of 650 horsepower. Some claimed they hit 695 on the dyno. And think about that for a second. In 1965, a really hot street engine might make 1 horsepower per cubic inch. The Camry was making 1.5 horsepower per cubic inch naturally aspirated on carburetors, no turbo, no supercharger, no nitrous. Just brilliant engineering and Nevada desert determination. The physical engine itself was a monument to overkill. The block was Ford's race-proven side-oiler 427, with priority main oil galleries that fed the main bearings first, then the cam and rods. This meant the bottom end could survive sustained high RPM operation without oil starvation. Ford strengthened the main webbing and used cross-bolted main caps on the center 3 journals. The forged steel crankshaft was balanced to NASCAR specifications, and the connecting rods were forged steel with 1332-inch bolts. And the pistons were works of art, forged aluminum with full floating pins and a compression ratio of 12.5:1. That's race-only territory even today. The piston tops were domed to fill the hemispherical combustion chambers with valve reliefs cut deep enough to prevent any chance of valve-to-piston contact, even with the massive cam lift. But the real party piece was those heads. Each aluminum head weighed about 60 pounds, relatively light considering their size. The cam towers rose up like Gothic architecture, with the chain case covering the timing gear at the front. The chains themselves were double-roller pieces, similar to what you'd find in industrial equipment. They had to be. At 7,500 RPM, those chains were whipping around at speeds that would destroy lesser hardware. Nuenford even developed special valve covers for the Camry. These weren't just tin stampings, but cast aluminum pieces with proper baffling to prevent oil from pooling around the valve springs at high RPM. Every detail was thought through with racing in mind. The intake manifold was another piece of racing sculpture. The single carb version stood nearly a foot tall, with long, sweeping runners designed to build velocity and maintain mixture quality at high engine speeds. The ports were massive, large enough that Holman Moody's mechanics joked you could drop a golf ball through them. The dual quad setup was even more impressive, with 2 600 CFM Holley carburetors perched atop a cross-ram-style manifold that looked like something from a drag racing fever dream. Here's where the Nevada connection becomes crucial. Holman Moody's desert shop had something their Charlotte facility didn't: proximity to the Bonneville Salt Flats and the burgeoning West Coast drag racing scene. While the Charlotte shop focused on NASCAR development, the Nevada crew was secretly testing the Camry in conditions that would never be allowed on a NASCAR superspeedway. They were running aviation fuel, experimenting with nitromethane blends, and pushing the engine to its absolute limits. The drag racing tests were revelatory. In a lightweight 1965 Mustang, the SOHC 427 was running quarter-mile times in the low 10-second range right out of the box. With development, they got into the 9s. Remember, this is 1965. Most superstock cars were struggling to break into the 11s. The Camry-powered cars were so fast that the NHRA initially didn't know how to classify them. But NASCAR was watching, and they didn't like what they saw. Bill France Sr., NASCAR's founder and president, had built his sanctioning body on the principle of relatively stock cars racing each other. The Chrysler Hemi had already pushed that envelope. The SOHC 427 didn't just push it, it set it on fire and laughed at the ashes. Nah. The political maneuvering that followed was pure racing theater. Ford submitted the SOHC 427 for NASCAR approval in early 1964, while it was still in development. They argued that if Chrysler could run hemispherical heads, Ford should be able to run overhead cams. It was advancing technology, they said. It was the future of American automotive engineering. Tenchman Chrysler's response was swift and brutal. They pointed out that the Hemi, while exotic, still used conventional push-rod valve actuation. It was something any decent mechanic could understand and work on. The overhead cam Ford? That was European nonsense that had no place in stock car racing. Plus, they argued, the development costs would force smaller teams out of competition. NASCAR's technical committee was in a bind. Allow the camera, and Ford would likely dominate for years. Ban it, and risk losing Ford's massive financial support of the sport. The meetings went on for weeks, with both sides presenting engineering data, cost analyses, and thinly veiled threats about their future participation in NASCAR. The ruling, when it came, was devastating for Ford. NASCAR declared that the SOHC 427 could be run, but only with a weight penalty so severe it would negate any performance advantage. We're talking about adding 400 pounds to the minimum weight. In racing, where every 10 pounds costs you a tenth of a second, 400 pounds was a death sentence. Furthermore, they required that the engine be available in production cars sold to the public, something Ford couldn't economically justify for such a limited production, expensive engine. Enford's executives were apoplectic. They'd spent an estimated $10 million, that's about $95 million in today's money, developing the camera, and NASCAR had essentially banned it with bureaucratic nonsense. The war of words that followed was legendary. Ford threatened to pull out of NASCAR entirely. They actually did boycott several races in 1965, leaving Chrysler to compete mostly against themselves. But here's the thing about racers, they're going to race one way or another. If NASCAR wouldn't let the camera compete, drag racing would. And that's exactly what happened. Holman Moody's Nevada shop pivoted hard into NHRA competition, where the SOHC 427 was not only legal, but welcomed with open arms. The results were immediate and devastating. Gas Rondeau's camera-powered Mustang became the first door slammer to run 8s in the quarter mile. Connie Kalita's SOHC dragster was virtually unbeatable in Top Fuel Eliminator. The engine that was supposed to dominate NASCAR circles instead dominated drag strips from Nevada to New Jersey. The technical evolution continued even after the NASCAR ban. Holman Moody developed specialized versions for different racing applications. They created destroyer heads with even larger valves and ports for all-out drag racing. They experimented with different cam profiles, some for low-end torque, others for screaming top-end power. They even built marine versions for offshore powerboat racing, where the camera's high RPM capability gave it a massive advantage over conventional big blocks. The limited production run makes the SOHC 427 story even more fascinating. Ford officially built 657 complete engines, though the actual number might be slightly higher when you count warranty replacements and spare assemblies. Each engine was essentially hand-built, with careful attention to tolerances and balance. The early engines had teething problems, chain tensioner failures, valve spring issues, oil drainback problems from the heads. But Holman Moody's mechanics worked through each issue, developing fixes that Ford would incorporate into later production. The cost was astronomical for the era, A complete SOHC 427 crate engine from Ford cost $2,395 in 1965. That's when a complete new Mustang Fastback cost $2,589. You could literally buy an entire car for barely more than just this engine, but racers paid it gladly, because the Camry gave them something no amount of money could buy with a conventional engine, a technological advantage. And the engine's internal architecture was so advanced that it influenced Ford engine design for decades. The timing chain arrangement, with its hydraulic tensioner and guides, showed up in modified form on later overhead Cam-Ford engines. The valve spring technology developed for the Camry influenced Ford's NASCAR engines well into the 1970s. Even the port shapes and combustion chamber designs found their way into later Ford performance heads. What really sets the SOHC 427 apart is how it represented a philosophical divide in American performance engineering. Chrysler's Hemi was brute force refined, a conventional pushrod engine with exotic heads that made massive power through displacement and efficiency. Ford's Camry was technology unleashed, a glimpse of where engine design was headed, with overhead cams that would become standard on performance engines decades later. The irony is that NASCAR's ban probably made the SOHC 427 more legendary than any amount of Sunday victories could have. It became the ultimate Nash what-if-er engine, the banned technology that was too good for competition. Every Ford fan could claim their engine was so superior it had to be outlawed. Every Chrysler fan could argue it was never proven in real competition. The debate rages to this day. And the surviving engines have become the holy grail of Ford performance collecting. A complete, correct SOHC 427 can sell for $150,000 or more. That's not including the car it goes in. We're talking about just the engine. Original Camry parts are so valuable that reproduction companies have sprung up to make everything from valve covers to timing chains, catering to restorers willing to pay premium prices for correctness. But beyond the money, beyond the specifications, beyond the political drama, the SOHC 427 represents something bigger. It was American automotive engineering throwing off its conservative shackles and saying, "Reach, let's see what we can really do." It was Nevada mechanics and North Carolina racers taking on the establishment with nothing but ingenuity and determination. It was proof that in 1965, American engineers could build something that wouldn't look out of place in a Ferrari or Maserati. And the modern parallel is striking. Today we see manufacturers pushing boundaries with hybrid systems, electric motors, and advanced aerodynamics, only to have sanctioning bodies restrict or ban the technology to maintain competitive balance. The Camry was the 1960s version of that same struggle, innovation versus regulation, progress versus tradition. Nenditensdesin for the mechanics at Holman Moody's Nevada shop, the SOHC 427 was their masterpiece. They didn't just assemble Ford's exotic engine, they perfected it, developed it, and proved its dominance even when the racing establishment tried to kill it. They turned what could have been Ford's most expensive failure into a drag racing legend that still makes Chrysler fans nervous at reunion events. The engineering legacy lives on in unexpected ways. Walk into any Ford dealership today and look under the hood of a Mustang GT500. You'll find a supercharged dual overhead cam V8, making 760 horsepower. The DNA of the Camry is there, the commitment to advanced valve actuation, the pursuit of high RPM power, the refusal to accept that pushrod engines are the only answer. It just took 50 years for the technology to become mainstream. The SOHC 427 also taught Ford a valuable lesson about racing politics. Never again would they develop such exotic technology without first ensuring it would be legal for competition. Every racing engine since has been designed with rulebook restrictions in mind from day one. The Camry was the last time Ford engineers were given truly free rein to build the ultimate engine without compromise. Mentioned for collectors and enthusiasts, the Camry represents the pinnacle of 1960s American performance engineering. It's not just about the power, though 657 horsepower in 1965 was absolutely insane. It's about the ambition, the technical excellence, and the story of an engine so good it had to be banned. Every surviving SOHC 427 is a piece of that story, a monument to what happens when engineers are told to win at any cost. In the end, the technical specifications still impress even by modern standards. The specific output of 1.53 horsepower per cubic inch was extraordinary for a naturally aspirated engine on carburetors. The 7,500 RPM redline was territory that most American V8s wouldn't explore for another 2 decades. The aluminum heads with chain-driven overhead cams were literally 20 years ahead of their time in terms of mass production. American engines didn't consider the development timeline. From initial concept to running engines, Ford and Holman Moody created the SOHC 427 in less than 18 months. No computer simulations, no CFD analysis, no CNC machining centers, just slide rules, flow benches, and the kind of intuitive engineering that comes from decades of racing experience. The fact that they created something so advanced so quickly, with 1960s technology, makes the achievement even more remarkable. The Nevada desert provided the perfect testing ground for these engines. The dry air meant consistent atmospheric conditions for testing. The isolation meant they could run full throttle pulls without noise complaints. And the proximity to California's drag strips meant they could go from dyno to track in hours, not days. It was in Nevada that the Camry proved it wasn't just a dyno queen, but a legitimate racing engine that could take the abuse of competition. The human cost of the SOHC 427 program is often overlooked. 3 Holman Moody mechanics were injured in dyno explosions during development. 1 Ford engineer suffered permanent hearing loss from extended exposure to unmuffled Camry engines on the test stand. These were the days before comprehensive safety equipment, when development meant real risk to the people building and testing these monsters. The end of the SOHC 427 production was as sudden as its beginning. By late 1967, Ford had moved on to the new 385 series big blocks and the revolutionary Boss 429 with its semi-Hemi heads. The tooling for the Camry was sold off or scrapped. The remaining inventory of parts was dispersed to dealers and racers. What had been Ford's most advanced engine became a historical footnote almost overnight. Legends don't die that easily. In the 1970s and 80s, smart engine builders were scouring junkyards and old race shops for Camry parts. They knew what they had, an engine that could make power that even modern technology struggled to match. As the muscle car hobby grew, so did appreciation for the SOHC 427. What had been dismissed as too complex became celebrated as brilliantly advanced. And today, the Camry stands as perhaps the greatest what if in American motorsports history. What if NASCAR had allowed it to compete? Would Ford have dominated for years? Would Chrysler have developed something even more exotic in response? Would overhead cam engines have become standard in American performance cars decades earlier? We'll never know, because one ruling by NASCAR changed the entire trajectory of American performance engine development. The story of the SOHC 427 is ultimately about pushing boundaries. It's about engineers and mechanics who refused to accept that existing technology was good enough. It's about a Nevada race shop that helped create something so advanced, so powerful, that the racing establishment couldn't handle it. It's about an engine that was literally too good for its own good. And every time a modern Ford performance engine revs to redline, it carries a piece of the Camry's legacy. Every overhead cam V8 that rolls off a Detroit assembly line owes something to those 657 engines built in 1964 and 1965. The SOHC 427 didn't just outsmart the competition, it outsmarted its own era, providing a glimpse of a future that wouldn't arrive for decades. For those lucky enough to hear a camera run in person, it's an almost religious experience. The mechanical symphony of chains, cams, and valves creates a sound unlike any other American V8. It's higher pitched than a traditional big block, more mechanical, more urgent. It sounds like what it is, an engine operating at the very edge of 1960s technology, making power in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The Nevada mechanic who first fired up a completed SOHC 427 must have known they were witnessing history. This wasn't just another hot rod engine. This was American engineering excellence distilled into 427 cubic inches of barely controlled explosion. It was proof that given the freedom to innovate, American engineers could build something that would stand with any engine in the world. The SOHC 427 remains the most powerful, normally aspirated engine Ford ever built for public sale in the 1960s. It remains one of the most valuable American performance engines ever created. And it remains the engine that was so good, so advanced, so dominant, that it had to be banned before it could prove just how superior it really was. That's not just engineering, that's legend. And now, what's the most impressive banned technology you've ever heard about in motorsports? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Ford's most controversial engine, hit that subscribe button for more stories of automotive innovation that push too hard against the establishment. Until next time, keep those engines running, and remember, sometimes being banned is the highest compliment engineering can receive.